you need a strong, sustainable community, which leads to a strong, sustainable tourism industry. So we really need to work with that. Through the LBTA, through COVID, we launched the Adopt a Worker campaign, sitting outside the box, where we targeted people that had existing places here to employ or basically house seasonal staff at a discounted rate. It could have been in a granny flat or a unit or something like that. It worked okay, but then COVID hit again, we got locked down and we didn't get our internationals back. So, but saying that, it worked in really raising awareness of the staff shortages around, and it did get picked up nationally. Noosa jumped on board and Port Macquarie also jumped on to try and think outside the box what we could do around this too. So got some good media coverage and things. So we're still rolling with that. We might not have got them directly through the Lorne business traders, but businesses I know, for example, did get people coming and say, you know, I've got a house or model houses. How about you, one of your chefs go in there or something? But it comes down to being affordable too. Last year we worked really successfully with Great Ocean Road Coast Committee or GORCAPA to get some seasonal campsites. Now, previously backpackers used to have to walk up to Allenvale or stay at other places and walk back in. It wasn't ideal for people employing them, and that stopped also with the new Parks Victoria. But this year we secured 6 sites, about $160 a week, really affordable, which works out they can sleep up to 4 people on each site. So that worked great. It works out about $40 per person per week for our backpacker market, central to Lorne, be able to walk to work as long as they want, and also sign up with GORCAPA and work with the business traders. So that was a really good success. That finished now, and moving forward with that, we're looking to start that process earlier. I know GORCAPA are meeting with the relevant park managers, not just in Lorne, but further afield, to see if they can start this process early, and that's what we'd like to see. From a business point of view, is to be able to advertise great positions to work in Lorne, which everyone loves to do, but also offer them affordable accommodation. Now that did fix the backpacker market, that were happy to camp or have their own camper van or a tent, which was good in town, but it doesn't fix the problem that we've had if we want to attract families, working families, or the higher end chefs and things that want to be able to work and live in Lorne. So we're looking to push that further, which is good. What did happen has happened with as you know, with the Grand Pacific, that's been rented out to Maryvale. So that's got full of the staff for the Lorne Hotel, and also the backpackers was used for other of the bigger com. It was mostly used for that staff for the motel, but keeping in mind that took the pressure off the town to accommodate 50 to 100 other workers that they wouldn't be able to accommodate. So that was a good outcome also. So continuing with us, what we'd like to see where to now is some of the holiday accommodation that's previously been full or used in the past, like the backpackers, looking to either change the permits from a holiday accom to worker accom, so people are allowed to stay in cottages for longer term. That would be a good outcome also. And basically, we wanted to be able to secure long-term affordable housing for workers and families in the town moving forward. That's what we'd like to see. You look at the ratio of amount of houses that are in Lorne that are unoccupied all year. If it's 1,000, give us 1% or 2%, that's 10 houses, 20 houses. So it's not a big ask to someone, but it's also, you've got to be able to make that affordable for the people who would previously rent them out at Airbnb. Some of the options that I've seen elsewhere that possibly could work is, instead of people that have multiple houses being stung with the taxes that are coming out and the land tax and everything else, is look to, if they're going to offer it to a local family or a working family in Lorne, is to somehow to subsidise them costs so it reduces the rent, basically. So another option that is being trialled at other tourism destinations is the Section 88 worker visa. Currently, you're allowed to work 1 year in Victoria as a seasonal worker, then you've got to go pick some fruit for 3 months to get your second year visa. I know tourism destinations, I think one's trying it in Victoria would be to be able to work in a cafe or work anywhere in hospitality, for 3 months, and we can secure that worker. So then it maybe secures that long-term worker affordability also. But just touching base again, Lorne's always been a charm down here. It's been compounded with COVID, the lack of affordable rents. We all know that's an issue, but where to now? I think we've come up with some great short-term answers with the caravans and the campsites available through Gore Kappa, but we need to achieve some really good results that we can achieve short-term and long-term out of these sessions we have too. So any questions, shoot them through and I'll happily answer them. And I hope that summarises a little bit what's been going on the last year or two through the business traders.
That's really helpful, Leon. We're going to have questions after each speaker for about 5 minutes, and then at the end of the session we're going to have a sort of general questions for everyone. So I'm going to ask you to start putting your hands up or type into the chat immediate questions for Leon. Leon, I had one. How are you guys able to track the numbers of beds you need for the numbers of workers? Like what's the mechanism to know that whether you need 50 or 100, and who tracks that and who keeps that information? Yeah,
so we went out a couple of years ago when COVID hit, because when COVID hit we lost all our seasonal workers. So we went out through the adopter worker to say, okay, we need upwards to 200 staff in Lorne to cover the peak season. That was surveying existing restaurants that are here or through our database. So restaurants, accommodation providers, retailers, to say how many do you need to make the town work. We knew them a couple of years we didn't get the staff. So what we did, which a lot of other cafes and restaurants did, was limited menus or making people aware there might be a little bit longer wait and things like that too. So we can definitely go out and survey and say, this is what we need to run off a minimum in the town for our business traders to open 100%. But on the back of that too, we need more people living here to make it sustainable. So we're not just talking about the internationals coming in, which is great, or the domestic tourism coming in. We're talking about our local community in growing that, which is a fairly big chomp in the off season for us here down here. So we can definitely survey out, which we have done, to be able to come back to council and everyone say we need X amount of beds available for sure.
And are you getting good cooperation with your surveys? Does everyone fill them out?
Yeah, we haven't done one for a while, but we do. We've got the group that we're involved with, the business traders. It's a small group, but we like to think we're respected between our peers and bounce off. And to be honest, it's all in best interest. So we know we can talk to anyone and say what do we need to survive, but how do we survive and make it so Lorne's open 24/7 and ready to go.
Okay, Alicia, do you have some people with questions?
I have one hand up, but it's Anna. So I think Anna's got a question from the chat.
Hi, thanks, Leon. No, it's actually my own question, but
okay, sorry.
Just wondering, so does that accommodation at the caravan park, does that end? Does it? It's not all year round.
At the moment, yeah, it's based on what you're allowed to have in the caravan park and that type of accommodation based on that too. So it's based on a seasonal type of the backpacker worker. So it's based on the peak season. So it finished in after Easter and starts around Melbourne Cup weekend, which is when we get the influx of our seasonal workers. Fixes the seasonal workers, but it doesn't fix the long-term people that want here. So what we look at, we've got some workers that want to stay now, would love to be able to offer and say, look, here's a 1, 2, 3 bedroom house available at this cost, either subsidised through the business or through your own rent as such. So it fixes that short-term type, but that's a conversation to have with Gore Kappa to see what we can increase around that type also, but also other avenues that we can look at also, for sure.
Anna, do you have other comments from the chat you want to bring forward?
Oh, yes, please. I've got one from Steve, and it says, if existing farm properties were opened up for seasonal workers subject to council approval, might the Lorne traders be willing to run a minibus within, say, 5 kilometre radius of Lorne to transport workers?
Yeah, it's a great idea. And with council last year or the year before, we got the 3-month trial where you're allowed to have camper vans and campers back on your property, which is great. So that was a good outcome also. And that came out of the housing working group, which was really good too. But definitely it's something that would consider. But again, the business traders associations are non-for-profit, so we don't have the money or capacity to run a bus, but there's nothing saying that you couldn't do that. Depending how many people, it's definitely a conversation we'd be willing to have for sure. See how we could work around that. There's always ways to work around that to get workers down for sure. Definitely.
Great. And they keep going.
And there is a question from an Anna. Perhaps it's not you, Anna, forgive me. Anna, who's got her hand raised, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question?
No, that is me.
It is you. Okay, it just went up again when I put it down, so I was just a bit confused. Is there another question in the chat, perhaps?
Yes, I have a comment and sort of a question, and it's from Rosemary, and it's, I think that we seem to focus on mainly seasonal workers or workers without families who are generally only looking to live in Lorne for 1 to 3 years. We need to focus on what Leon is saying and more families and young couples who are wanting to live in Lorne for 5+ years and make it their permanent home.
Yeah, definitely. I didn't touch base on that, but solely agree with that. You know, our population is dwindling in the under 60 market for sure, and we've lost a lot of families down here. But yeah, definitely, we need to really make it enticing for people to be able to live in Lorne in a long-term affordable rentals. That's just the crux of it. It's a nationwide area, but yeah, Lorne is dwindling with families. You know, local school, everything. We really need them families back, or we need a solution to entice them here. You know, to work and live for our community instead of shrinking it for sure.
And a lot of people who start out as seasonal would want to make it their permanent home.
Oh, definitely. My wife. Yeah, straight up.
I think there's a couple of other ones in the chat. I don't know if you can see them, Anna. There's a question from Shane as well. Can you see that one all right?
I've had Shane's one about Leon, but the rest of them are general. Okay.
So I think there's one on granny flats and tiny houses, and also the link to childcare, which I think we'll come back to in the larger session. Do you have anybody else with their hand up?
No hands up at this stage.
Okay, so I think there's two comments about the tiny houses in Deans Marsh, and also we need to solve lots of problems at the same time, and the childcare being one of them. So we can come back to that. I'm just mindful of the time and want to move to the next speaker, and then the next speaker after that, and then come back and deal with all the questions. So please continue to put more questions into the chat for Anna, and you can put your hand up also in relation to asking questions, or if something doesn't make sense while the speaker is presenting. Thanks for that, Leon. The next person I'd like to very much like to introduce is Councillor Libby Stapleton. She's an Aireys Inlet resident. She's a former mayor, and she's passionate about affordable housing. And we've invited her to speak about what's happening in Aireys Inlet, so that Lorne can see if there's some lessons that we can take away from that. So over to you, Libby.
Thank you so much, Penny, and it's great to see so many people on the webinar and interested in this very important subject. I've just got a few slides to share, so just bear with me while I get the slideshow up. Great, thank you. So as Penny mentioned, I'm talking about the Aireys Inlet Affordable Housing Project. And I'd like to start by acknowledging that I'm coming to you this evening from Aireys Inlet, which is on Wadawurrung country and was traditionally known as Mangawak, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So just a brief bit of background, as you've heard from some of the other speakers, and obviously the reason we're all here is because there is a really significant need for social and affordable housing in our shire. Private rental vacancy rates are below 1%, but you know, that's across the shire, and I know the reality is that for our coastal communities it's probably closer to 0%. I know in Aireys, Inlet and Lorne that's definitely the case. So, I saw someone in the chat earlier just sort of ask a question around need, and obviously it's sort of broader than this, but focusing on Anglesey and Aireys Inlet, we know that right now there are 636 people on the waiting list for social housing just in Anglesey and Aireys Inlet alone. We currently have 30 social housing dwellings in those two townships, and across the Surf Coast Shire there are 97 social housing dwellings. So you can see already that the need is significant, and that doesn't take into account all the key workers that are looking for housing as well. So I think, as Gary mentioned at the outset, you know, we as a council have had do have a really great commitment to addressing the ongoing problem of housing affordability and affordable accommodation. And this was identified not just by us as councillors, but through an extensive community engagement program at the outset of our term, and has been put in our 4-year council plan as a strategic priority. We developed a social housing policy in August 2021, and then an affordable accommodation action plan was endorsed early in 2022. And that action plan has an enormous sort of volume of work in it. But one of the items was that we would explore options for social and affordable housing on council-owned sites that might be suitable. And one of those sites was 2 Fraser Drive in Aireys Inlet. So that kicked off a process which has been, I guess, ongoing now for just over 18 months. We had an extensive community engagement process last year, and the feedback that we got through that process helped to inform an expression of interest process, which was to seek a suitable housing provider to work with council and, importantly, the community on this social and affordable housing project. A really significant part of this project, and I guess something that is really important to us as a council, is to have a community advisory group working really closely with the housing provider on a co-design process to ensure that there's support and ownership for the project as we move along. So that community advisory group has met 5 times in the last few months, and they're comprised of 10 members, some of whom I'm sure are on the webinar tonight, who have been working really hard on the design and the objectives and the priorities for this site. So just to give you an idea of the scale and location, this is the site here. I think hopefully you can see my cursor moving around the screen, but if not, you can see 2 sort of clear blocks of land on Fraser Drive, which is just behind the top shops at Aireys Inlet, if you know Aireys Inlet. And in the bottom of that image, you'll see a pathway which comes down from Albert Drive and onto the site. So the area in the green border is the existing community garden in Aireys Inlet, and we've committed to keeping that community garden under council ownership. And then you'll see in the blue border, sort of the right-hand bottom corner of the screen or of the image, are 4 existing social housing dwellings. And those dwellings have been there since the 1990s. And this site as a whole had been earmarked for some time as a potential location for aged care accommodation. But through our recent sort of process, we've identified it as one of the most suitable places we have in the Shire as council-owned land that we could allocate to affordable housing. So that's how the project came about. And I will move on to, so essentially, sorry, the blank the empty blocks of land are essentially the space that we're now looking at to working to develop and create the housing project. Those 4 existing social house dwellings will be part of the site, and those tenants will remain in their accommodation, whether they subsequently move into the new accommodation or stay in that accommodation is still being worked through. So in terms of project status, as you can see here, the timeline, we're in the sort of the middle part. We've just completed the May 2023 phase 3 section. So last weekend we had an intensive co-design workshop here in Aireys Inlet with our community advisory group and representatives from Housing Choices Australia. So Housing Choices Australia is the housing provider that we have chosen to work with. There was an extensive expression of interest process. We received 3 really high quality applications to work with council on this project, and Housing Choices Australia is the proponent that was selected. So they met with the community advisory group and other key members of the community last weekend, and we spent a full day on a co-design process. So now Housing Choices Australia will be able to take back the feedback around the built form, landscaping, how the space will interact with the existing community garden and other public spaces, and really start to nut out the details of the plan and the funding strategy that would be required. So we know, the Community Action Group has put a lot of time and effort into thinking about the design principles for this site, and there was, really great consideration and discussion over the weekend at the workshop about what that will look like. And at this stage, it's too early to say how many buildings, how many people, but, really rough designs on the weekend were kind of in the range of, maybe around 9 buildings that accommodate sort of 30 plus people, and that would be a combination of 1, 2 and 3 bedrooms, so that we're meeting that need sort of for, whether they're single key workers or single women over 55, which we know is a growing and important cohort, or importantly, families who no longer have access to affordable accommodation in the community. We're expecting a final design concept and funding strategy and detailed proposal to come back to council. We have it on the timeline at August. That may be a little ambitious, but certainly before the end of the year, we should be in a position to really make decisions about what this project's going to look like and move it to the next stage. I think my slides have just frozen, which isn't helpful. So, oh, there we go. Have you got the community support side now?
Yes, we're on that.
Great.
The community
Thanks,
reaction.
Yeah. So this is my last slide. Just really, I guess I wanted to emphasise the point that the community support for this project has been critical to its success. Obviously, there's many things that will be critical to the success of a project like this, but we knew from the outset that engaging with the community and making sure that we had a community that was not just aware but involved and out there championing a project like this was really important. And council was, absolutely overwhelmed at the support that was evident through phase 1 of the community engagement. I know that the image you can see on the screen there is from the first phase of engagement, and there were many locals who identified with the issue, whether it was through their own family members and friends who'd been pushed out of accommodation, or whether they, are running a local business and having trouble getting staff, like Leon was talking about earlier. But many of them put their hands up to be the face of a local sort of communications program to help inform people about the issue and the need. And we know that working closely with the community advisory group through this process has helped us to understand some of the barriers that exist in the community. Although, you know, I live in Aireys Inlet and have been here for 20 years, so I'm very aware of what some of those barriers might be, but I'm also really aware that it's a community that's really invested in trying to find a solution, obviously to try and make a difference in people's lives, but also to help make sure that our town not just remains viable long term, but is a really vibrant and welcoming place to live in the longer term. So working with the community has been really important in that sense. And that's probably enough for me at the moment, but happy to answer any questions. Thanks, Penny.
Thanks so much, Libby. So please put your questions into the chat for Anna or raise your hand for Alicia. Libby, my question was 9 buildings and 30 people, but you've got a big list of, you know, the need is so big, you know, so how are you going to deal with that difficulty of the first 30?
Yeah, and look, you know, it's probably a bit premature for me to say 9 buildings and 30 people, because that really was just sort of, you know, rough designs that came out of the workshop on Saturday. So that will need to be worked through, and will be a bit dependent on the funding model that the housing provider opts with, because that will have, I guess, parameters around who's eligible and that sort of thing. But I guess the social housing register has, as I mentioned at the start, those 636 people currently on the waiting list, and they're in 2 tiers. So I guess though there are those, I think about half, and Alicia can correct me if I get the numbers wrong, but I think about half are probably in that critical category of being most in need, and then there's a secondary category which would accommodate people earning up to sort of around, you know, families earning up to around about $100,000 a year under that definition of what's affordable housing. In terms of who gets access, there will definitely be priority given to people. Well, the intention is that it's people who are already connected to the community and the township. So that's part of the, I guess, the strategy that's going to come back to council for consideration. But I don't know if any of the officers on the call wanted to add anything sort of more specific around that in terms of how we're prioritising who gets access to the housing.
Does anyone else from the council want to comment? We've also got some questions in the chat, I see, Anna.
That's true, and we have a hand up as well. I guess I can comment to the extent that it is, you know, only a handful, and it only sort of begins to address a really big problem. But we're hoping it's a project that demonstrates just how important social and affordable housing is to communities. It's vital social infrastructure and part of every community, every vibrant community. So we're hoping it's the first of many projects, and then we can start to address more of that need. Anna, would you like to do chats first, or shall we go with hands up?
Hands up. If you've got some.
Oh,
thank you. Yeah,
it is. It's Anna's. Yeah.
My question is anonymous, and it's, what sort of budget did the council set aside for this project?
So look, essentially, council historically hasn't had any sort of resources allocated to housing, and our biggest investment has been actually staffing, employing a strategic housing advisor to work with us on this project. And there was also a lot of work done through our alliance with G21, who undertook housing affordability study for the region. So that was a position that was funded through G21, but in effect, the councils that are members of G21 obviously all contributed to that alliance. So yeah, our investment is really at this stage staffing. The project will be funded. So Surf Coast Shire has $20 million allocated to it through the big build, the state government's big build. I I believe about $5 million of that has already been allocated to a housing project in Winchelsea. So at the moment, there's still $15 million sitting on the books that a housing provider would have access to, assuming they meet the required sort of criteria to put towards this project. So that will all be part of the funding model that comes back to council for approval later in the year. I hope that answers the question adequately.
Yeah, and Anna, another question from the chat.
This is from Graham. What is the working definition of social housing?
So I think the working definition of social housing, and Alicia might have to help me out on this one, but I think the range is around about $50,000 is the income cap for a couple or a couple with one dependent requiring social housing. There would obviously be other categories for people who, you know, are in emergency housing and that sort of thing.
Okay, we've got more questions. I'm going to move them to the 5 o'clock slot so that we can let Louise talk about community lands trusts, and then we'll come back to all the questions. We're hoping we can go through till 5:30 if we need. I also want to say, please ask questions even if you think someone doesn't know the answer, because we want to collect the questions together for the next webinar, and also we can do some homework in between times, so that, you know, don't worry if someone you don't know who's got the answer to your question. One of the participants may. We've got a number of people on the call that are already working in this area. So our next speaker, so thank you very much, Libby. And our next presenter is Louise Crabtree Hayes. Louise is at Western Sydney University. She's been a researcher and advocate in affordable and essential housing, and particularly she's known as an expert in communities lands trusts. And we don't know much about them at all, so we really want you to be able to lead us through what that might mean, given that it's been mooted in this report. That's something that Lorne should be investigating. So thanks, Louise.
Thanks, Penny. And I'll do the obligatory slide share. And while that's, I'm just finding these slides, I will also acknowledge country and say that I'm joining you from the Barramadigal lands of the Darug Nation. I want to extend respects to elders past and present, and also extend that to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander folk who are with us on the call tonight. And I also wanted to give a shout out to Ian Stewart and to Graham Braun for the work that they've done with the team here at Western Sydney Uni for quite some years now at looking at community land trusts. So I'm going to be doing the 10-minute sort of CLT 101. I will be happy for the slides to be shared, so please don't feel you've got to scribble frantically or anything like that. I'm happy for them to go out and to take questions afterwards. So what are CLTs? There's nothing that fancy to them, really. They're basically non-profit organisations that are formed to provide permanently affordable housing and community benefit. Now that's an intentionally broad definition, and it basically means that every community land trust can define those according to their community and to their need. And because of that, you see this incredible flexibility in their programs. So permanently affordable housing can mean affordable rentals, affordable ownership, as well as things in between those like co-ops, and all of these remain affordable in perpetuity, including the ownership options. You'll also get any physical form imaginable on a CLT. So you'll get apartments, freestanding houses, townhouses, but also the more sort of innovative things like co-housing. And again, that's because there's a community voice saying, this is what we need to see here in our region. This is what community benefit means to us. And a lot of the big community land trusts, you'll actually see a portfolio that's got a range of these. So they'll have rentals and affordable ownership. They'll have some apartments and some homes. So you'll see this incredibly sort of diverse portfolio. And because of that focus on community benefit alongside the housing, you tend to get non-housing outcomes as well. And so the point earlier about Childcare, you'll see all sorts of non-residential spaces being set up on CLT land as well. And that can be food production, parks, childcare shops, literally anything you can imagine you can set up on a CLT. And the prices for those, like if they're charging a rent, they can charge a sliding scale. So if it's a top-end shop, then they'll charge a top-end rent, and that could cross-subsidise something like a non-profit childcare centre, for example. So they can get quite nuanced in their portfolios because of that overarching vision that they've got. And they will be absolutely opportunistic and partner with anyone who is aligned to their mission. So that can be for or non-profit organisations, and like I said, cross-subsidising themselves with those income streams. So their main aim is to address a gap in a local system, and hence the diversity, because they're responding to that. They have an absolutely watertight policy of retaining the affordability, and so that's across any resales of affordable homes or inheritance events or any reletting. So if it's an ownership situation and someone passes away, then that affordability criteria stays in place at the point of inheritance. So someone can't come in and sell it for megabucks and walk away. They can sell at the restricted price if they don't have a need for the home, but it can't be turned into a speculative model. And as I said, addressing all of those community aspirations through partnerships and programs. So anything that you can imagine you can see on a CLT. And I've got the Dudley Street Neighbourhood Initiative board down the bottom. They're one of my favourite organisations. They're just amazing. And the reason I've got that photo in there is because that's their board, which is 34 people, including dedicated seats for young people. And those seats are allocated proportionally according to the demographics of their region. So incredibly sort of democratic organisation. They refer to themselves as the developers who don't go away because they're holding things in perpetuity, which means they build quality homes, because if they build bad homes, then they're going to be dealing with that in 20 or 30 years' time. So you tend to get much better housing outcomes because they're invested in the long term and because they're community driven. So they're not interested in putting people into bad homes. And as I said, anything you can do on land, you can do on a CLT. So this is their classic structure of their board. So the big ones can have like 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 voting members. Anyone who's a member can run to be on the board, and they tend to split their board up in these three ways. So you've got people who live in the homes, then you've got people who don't live in the homes but who live in the region and believe in the mission and are voting members of it. And then you've got this other third of sort of strategic board members who can bring additional skills in or can be particular allies, and they're typically appointed by the other 2/3. So you've got this very strong community say. And as I said, many of them have got memberships that are much bigger than their resident base because they're these big community-based entities. And so it means that anyone living in the region can actually take part in it. So rather than, as we've seen, you can get sort of pushback against affordable housing. With the CLTs, you tend to get this immense buy-in because it's not, well, what's this organisation coming into our region and building this stuff? It's, well, I'm actually part of this. I know what it is, and I can bring my decision, my concerns to a meeting, and I can run for the board and all of those sorts of things. So it's very much about bringing appropriate and diverse voices and skills into an ongoing productive dialogue about those two core aims. What's permanent affordability mean, and what does community benefit mean? And then those can change over time. So you've got that ongoing ability to have that discussion. And as I said, this classic structure aims to balance the resident community and broader societal needs. So no one party of those three can dominate things. And this is the result of lots of trial and error in the United States where things went wrong in all sorts of ways. So we can sort of piggyback on the success and say, okay, now that they've done all of the things wrong, we can learn from that. And as I said, the members and residents run for the board and typically appoint that remaining third. So because of that, you have a lot of transparency and consistency of their policies and programs, a lot of just being absolutely upfront about their mission, how they operate, all of their procedures and policies. Membership's open to anyone who lives in their service area, however that's defined, and they have very clear housing eligibility criteria. So the question before about how people are selected, with the CLTs, there's usually an income bracket, connection to place and community, and they might stipulate other criteria for for particular projects. Say this one's for families, for example, or this one's for young people trying to get into employment, so they can add additional ones in. They tend to always be oversubscribed, so they run a lottery system once those key criteria are met, to make sure that it's actually fair and there's complete transparency around those processes as well. Now, big caveat, they're not trusts as we understand them here in Australia. So please don't be thinking about trust law. We've been advising people to not use the word trust in their name, because you don't want to be a trust as constituted under Australian law, because if you are, then there's a relationship set up between the trustees and the benefactors, which means the board is your trustees, your benefactors are the people that you're serving, and they can't run to be on your board. So you totally lose that community voice. So we've just telling people you can call yourselves a CLT, just don't say the word trust, because you don't want to end up in that particular pickle, or you just can't have an empowered community. And it's definitely not a trust benefactor relationship. It's very much a flat structure of community governance. So let's have a look at them. We've seen some really nice studies in the US. So through the foreclosure crisis of the thousands, they tracked their performance, and they were actually foreclosing at a rate that was about 1/6 of the open market, even though all of their mortgages were for people on low, moderate and very low incomes. So performed much better than the open market. Now, this is a lot of numbers, but this was a resale study done in Vermont of one of the big community land trusts there over a 20-year period from 1998 to 2008. They serviced 357 households, and it cost them $2.1 million to do that. And they looked at their equivalent of the first homeowners grant in comparison and said, if we'd been using that system, which they had in the States at the time, it would have cost $10.5 million to help those 357 households. Or if we just spent the 2.17, we would have only been able to help 152 households. So they've been a lot more effective, and that's basically because of the asset lock that happens at resale. People can't flip the home. If you get in at a resale at a subsidised price, you sell at a subsidised price, and that just made much bigger bang for the buck by holding those subsidies in place. The really nice thing is that 2/3 were then able to buy in the open market, and the affordability actually deepened at resale. So at the first sale, they were affordable to people on 62% of area median income. At resale, they were affordable to people on 57% of area median income. So people built equity, they were able to move into the open market, and the homes became more affordable over time. So really nice resale study showing the effectiveness of that. A more recent study in 2019 showed over 90% of the homes were affordable for households on 80% of AMI or less. And again, at resale, properties remained affordable at a similar income, and they kept housing below 30% of income, which is that critical housing stress indicator. And again, while enabling wealth creation. So people have accumulated wealth during all periods. And when the house, if the market did go down, people experienced smaller decreases in home value. So they're protected from the crashes as well as the market not being overheated. They're also protected if the market does go sour. So that's a lot of words. Let's have a look at some pictures because they're way more fun. This is the Champlain Housing Trust, which was the one that did the resale study. They operate over 3 counties. They've got over 4,000 voting members, 1,600 rental units, 600 owner-occupied units, and 100 cooperative housing units, all sorts of housing forms, boarding houses through to freestanding homes. They've also got retail, aged care, childcare, a food shelf, a kitchen, a refugee centre, a queer safe space, a First Nations after school learning centre, a non-profit garage, a non-profit bike fixing garage, Vermont legal age, blah, 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 blah. So, and this is because they've just been there in time for 30 years now and just able to keep building and building and building what they do. They were established by the city with startup funding when Bernie Sanders was their mayor. The city invests the staff pensions into the trust, plus it diverts some of it through a local tax levy that they've got that supports affordable housing. And they got the UN Habitat Award for the Global North in 2008. So this is what it looks like. That's affordable home ownership on the left there. a limited equity co-op on the top right, a rental co-op on the bottom right, with commercial real estate at the street level, and that's directly opposite their city hall. So right in the middle of downtown through to, they've got farms, they've got farmhouses, the whole caboot. And these are some of the non-profit uses that I talked about as well, because they've been able to offer those properties at a cheaper rent to get non-profit spaces up in their community as well. So, whirlwind tour, I know, and as I said, happy to take questions, and I'll be sharing the slides. The main reflections are they're not trusts, as I said here, they're community-based non-profits, analogous to our community housing providers like Housing Choices, but with that really big community voice, which is the primary difference, and also doing more than the affordable rentals as well, because they're able to step into that home ownership space. As I said, the key objective is the provision and the retention of affordable, appropriate and quality housing and community outcomes, very much in perpetuity. We know they're under investigation here in Australia by existing community housing providers and councils and community groups. So we're sort of at a who gets there first moment in time in Australia. And all of these have been points of origin for community land trusts internationally. So there's no one size fits all, one model, one path to glory. It's whatever's going to work according to circumstance and community intention. And we know there's market interest and growing community desire for better options and for more choices between owning and renting and stepping into that intermediate space as well to give people that longer term security and somewhere to go to when they're no longer eligible for community housing, because that's a real issue that our community housing providers are finding is when people are no longer eligible, there's literally nothing for them to move out into. And so this is very much looking at that intermediate space as well and just giving people more options that are permanently affordable and quality homes. So that's me. I'm done and I'm happy to take questions and I will share my slides. So thanks so much for having me.
Thanks, Louise. That's been fantastic, and I'm glad we're having more than one webinar to be talking about some of these issues. While people are putting their questions into the chat or putting their hand up, can I just ask, do we know whether there's a minimum sort of population size to sustain something like that, or can they be in small places and big places, or is there any research on that, please?
Yeah, look, they're in every conceivable size possible, and the issue, as with any non-profit housing project, is really how you get land or stock into the system in the first place. And so because they're a subsidised housing product, they need subsidisation in some form, whether it's land or, like I was saying with Champlain, an affordable housing tax levy that comes through the local rates. The one thing I know from internationally is that if the community land trust is charging a ground lease fee, so if you own your home, there's an admin fee to the community land trust because it is a permanent sort of relationship. That tends to be a minimal amount of money, so you're not put back into housing stress. And there seems to be about a threshold of 50 households or so for that rent to cover the cost of having someone there to oversee resales. But that's a very rubbery figure. There are CLTs that are really quite small and ones that are really quite substantial, similar to our existing community housing providers.
Okay, thank you. Anna, do you have questions from the chat?
Definitely there's the question around, so are there any of these in Australia yet, which seems to me that no, is that right?
There's one in Queensland.
Yeah, and that guy's, we're in contact with that guy. So there's one at South Moreton Bay in Queensland, and that's and they're in a resort community up against a national park. So they can't build on new land, and they're using existing housing stock. So he was willing to talk to us a year ago. So we're hoping he's still willing to give a webinar to us. We were waiting until the report came out, but yeah, he's lined up to tell us how we did it.
Yeah, and I know there's groups forming in a number of, there's a group in Bellingen, there's one in the Blue Mountains. Bellingen have just released their proof of concept report, which is online, so you can download that from the council there. There's groups forming sort of all over. It's just beyond the Queensland mob, sort of who gets the first house on the ground is really the race we're in at the moment.
So is the other main questions are around, do you think it's suitable in Lorne, and how long does something like this take?
Well, I mean, it's not really my place to say what's suitable in Lorne. That's really for the community to say if it's suitable. I think absolutely, whether it's through agencies, through Housing Choices or other CHPs or something like a CLT, there clearly needs to be some kind of intervention in terms of getting stock into the region that's affordable in perpetuity. And I think for me, the perpetual strength of the CLTs is the community voice, and I was really encouraged by the participation and consultation that's going on with the Aireys Inlet project. So the more that community aspirations can be informing what's built, I think the better in terms of the housing outcomes that you'll see. But I would say that given that gap between community housing, which is what Housing Choices is able to do, and the open market, I think there's absolutely a need for something that bridges that gap, which is where something like CLTs with that affordable ownership component can step into the mix, because otherwise you'll end up with a situation where people won't go for promotion or because they're worried they're going to lose their housing. And we've seen that happening in the sector, or people will try and get a mortgage. It'll just be too much. Something goes a bit wrong. They lose the home, and then they're back on the queue to the community housing provider that they've just moved out of. So you get these absolute gaps and these incredibly sort of unfortunate outcomes. So I think there's definitely a need for something that can span that gap.
I might open the questions up to anyone now. So Louise, you can answer, or if Libby or Gary or Leon want to answer as well, please do so. Louise, the second part of that question you missed, which is how long does it take, from go to woe to do one?
Sorry.
We can ask the Queensland guy when he comes, but asking you is helpful as well.
Yeah, no, look, I guess, sorry.
I was going to say there's a question that really fits into that nicely too, which is what are the stumbling blocks to getting a CLT up and running? So maybe you could cover both in one go.
Yep, not a problem. So the time thing, it's a bit of a piece of string question. It depends on the base you're starting from. If you've got some existing housing ready to go, then it can be really quite quick, because it's really just, okay, what's the best form for us to incorporate in? What's our waiting list? How do we get people in? I think most of them tend to be a bit slower, because it's like, well, we have an intention and we want to form a CLT and we want to have something. Now we have to try and get property. And that can be the toughest part, is getting homes or land into the system. The other stumbling block is if you're offering people a resale restricted home ownership product, and we've suggested doing that. Well, you can either do it on a leasehold basis where someone buys a long-term lease, which stops and restarts every time there's a sale or an inheritance event or what have you. Banks have trouble understanding leaseholds, which is weird, because the entirety of the ACT is leasehold. The bit that I don't seem to understand is the resale restriction and what happens if someone goes into arrears. And so there's a bit of hand-holding that has to happen with the lenders, just getting them to understand that what they get a claim on is the fact that the CLT will step in and find another buyer who will come in at that resale restricted price. So the bank doesn't get to come in and claim it, but that there is a security, there's a security there and there's a process there. And it's just getting that familiarity into the lending landscape. But there are some lenders who are sympathetic to the sector, and that's mainly in the mutuals and the community banks because they're mission aligned. They understand the non-profit space. So it's land and finance, yeah, and that's the stumbling block to affordable housing across the board. So they're not alone in that one.
Mm-hmm. Anna, do you have more questions or comments from the chat?
I think my main ones at the moment are, well, I've got Lee Beveridge, and it sort of speaks to this and the previous. So if you're targeting the prospects, if you're targeting the prospects of improving long-term housing options for people who are currently potentially working in Lorne, which includes hospital staff, school teachers, there is no way they will qualify for social housing. They need reasonably priced, affordable, and most importantly, stable housing options. This is different to social and community housing. And then you went on to say, like, any of these people, they can't afford a $2 million house mortgage, but they're going to be over a salary of 100,000 combined income.
Yeah, and that's the point I was making earlier about needing to speak to that gap between the community housing eligibility and where that cuts out and what's actually affordable out there in the market, and people just falling into that gap. So that's absolutely where these models step in as it's called an intermediate housing product, because you don't have full ownership, you've got partial ownership in partnership with a non-profit agency, and that's absolutely the market that those target because of that gap.
Yeah, I've got another one. Can you advise, this is from Clive Goldsworthy, can you advise if there are any legal firms in Australia that can assist in the formation of a CLT?
Yeah, there's a few individual practitioners around. Derek Mortimer helped us with the drafting of the Community Land Trust Manual. And that's the other thing I should say is please don't reinvent the wheel. Please don't think you've got to start from scratch. We've written a manual and we wrote a follow-up book, and those are both available as PDFs. So I can flick those through to the organisers, and you can just send them out through emails or what have you. But they also should exist online if you just Google Australian CLT Manual. And the follow-up book was called Enabling CLTs in Australia. If you can't find either of them, just email me, but I'll also make sure that Penny and everyone's got copies so that they can go out. Bingo, there it is in the chat. Excellent.
Yeah. Alicia has a hand up.
Yes, it's sort of a bit of a link to all of the publications you just mentioned, Louise, and that's on the Grounded website. And I wondered also if you were in contact with them and provided Carl Fitzgerald et al. with some help around establishing a community land trust.
Yeah, so they're not a CLT as such, they're an advocacy agency.
Okay.
But yeah, I helped them get set up and sent them all of the PDFs. So they should be on the Grounded website as well. And there's the Australian Community Land Trust Network, which also exists. It's currently a bit old school. It's a Google group. It's got a website, but that hasn't been built yet. So that will be live, hopefully in the none too distant future. And that's got probably about 150 members on it at the moment. But that'll be another online repository for information, but also connecting with other people and organisations who are trying to set this up, because we're really trying to set up a network for people to share intel and to help each other out and just help build capacity.
Thank you. And I think Anna has some more perhaps from the chat.
This is my own question. So did Committee for Lorne's report propose a community lands trust, did it?
Yes, it's, well, Graham, do you want to speak to that? There's a section up. The report says we should explore a load of options, and certainly in relation to community lands trust, it says we should investigate that. And in fact, we've got people already hot to trot and trying to start it. So yes, that was one of the recommendations amongst a bunch of different things. Libby, my question was, is yours yours is not a community lands trust, or it is? Like, what's the architecture for yours and the board? What's is that the same status, legal status, as what Louise is talking about, or is it because the funding is different and the target group is different?
Yeah, no, it's not a community land trust, Penny. It's a different model, and its focus is on social and affordable housing. So it would have different limitations and different categories that they're targeting. But essentially, again, it will remain in ownership of the housing provider, assuming that's the model they go with. So Housing Choices Australia essentially owns and manages that property in perpetuity, and rents out those units or houses at an agreed rate.
So it sounds like one of the choices we've got to make in thinking about where the funding is coming from that might assist Lorne, because some of the funding will have targeted conditions associated with who is helped through this. And so when Louise was saying there's a different market that's targeted by the Community Lands Trust, and then also we've been telling people about another model altogether as well in Sydney, which uses the private market, and in fact it's quite different in how that operates. So there's like a set of decisions and choices that we have to think about as we think about the target group, who's served and which model is going to help the most. Remember, we can have several. We don't have to choose just one thing. We can
You're
actually,
right, Penny.
we can have several ways of doing this, particularly as we have seasonal workers and also full-time key and essential workers.
Yeah, and I don't think one particular model is going to solve all our problems either. It's going to need to be a combination of many things, and hopefully some changes in policy at a state and federal level as well.
Yes, thank you for making that clear. Alicia, you've got
sorry, I don't know who I interrupted. I was just going to say that we have Anna, I think, has a question from the chat, and then Graham Braun has his hand up as well.
Great.
Oh, I've just got a comment from Helen Clark. A Bank Australia member owned has done some terrific work on lending arrangements in the ACT and disability sector, including share arrangements, environment, sustainability requirements, part of the solution too.
Okay,
great comment.
Thank you.
And Graham, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question?
I think I am unmuted, aren't I?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, well, I think I was answering Penny's question. The reason why it's in the report is that there was a keen interest to ensure that the land remained and the property remained affordable, particularly since the experience in Lorne some years ago when there were a number of parcels of land that were sold under an affordability scheme but with no protection for the future. So the owners, when they sold, were able to take their capital gain and go away. And therefore it was only a one-cycle program. But the committee was very keen to see that this became enduring affordability. And at the time, the Community Land Trust was one of the ways, particularly since the committee had been a case study with Louise's research group, and it was. But I think you'll see there's careful wording through most of the report that says or equivalent, which and therefore the aspiration is to ensure that continuing affordability, to ensure that the leases are transferable, and that it can be a choice of rental accommodation or ownership, sharing the lease land. But that's the background.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you. I'd also like, Gary, you should be poised to make a comment or a question at this stage. You're very welcome. And also John Higgins, I'm putting you on notice as well as the new incoming chair of Committee for Lorne, what you've learnt from today. But first of all, are there any other comments that you want to pick out, Anna or Alicia, questions that you can see people with their hands up?
Yeah, I've got Are we going to general questions now?
Yes, yeah, these are general questions.
Oh, why, if all the stuff in Aireys has been done, was there no land identified in Lorne for a similar project?
People are trying to identify land in Lorne, aren't they?
Perhaps I could make a comment there, Penny.
Yeah, there you are, Gary, go for it.
We have been going through that process, and that's been going for a number of years now, for probably over the last 3 or 4 years. Recently, the CEO, myself and Clive, continued that process. So it's certainly one that is underway. It's not simple because a lot of the land that's available is under joint ownership, perhaps of the Shire and DECA. So it's not simple, but we're certainly undertaking that study.
Thank you. Anything else, Anna?
I've had a couple of questions online previously and in this chat about Dean's Marsh being land made available there, and then you'd need buses, but yeah.
Would anyone like to comment on Dean's Marsh being a partner with us in this, or help us solve this problem? Gary, do you have any comments on that? We can't. You have to unmute.
Yeah. Look, Dean's Marsh certainly is of interest, but there are problems associated with Dean's Marsh in terms of the overlays and the density question. But they're problems that we are looking at, and certainly it's on the agenda to investigate. But Dean's Marsh doesn't want to be, also the Dean's Marsh community may not want to be seen as a source of accommodation for Lorne. So we've got to be sensitive to the Dean's Marsh community as well as to our needs.
Thank you.
Graham Braun has his hand up.
Well, Gary's just said what I was going to say, that when we did interview people from Dean's Marsh, they were very particular about the community not wanting to become a dormitory suburb to Lorne, and it had its own aspirations for a type of community that it wanted to be and wanted to stay. And so there is that sensitivity that needs to be taken into account. The other reason why we were looking at community land trusts were before there were some changes which we can allude to, but there was the possibility that some private land that are close to or just beyond the boundaries of the town could be made available, and under the Land Environment Act of 1987, you can have what are called community offsets, which in short would be, if they were employed, would mean that you could get land for next to no cost or even free, or just the cost of the servicing. And therefore you reach the biggest goal and the biggest impediment in Lorne, which is land value and land availability. They're the two big impediments. And so that's why early in the piece, a community land trust was also seen as being a viable option, because you could perhaps pick up the land that way from people like St John Sutton, who's offered half his land to the community for some 10 or 15 years. Okay.
Thank you. Given the time now, I'm going to ask Gary if you've got any comments, and then I'm going to swap across to John, and I'm then going to outline what we're going to be doing next. This is the value of having all this in the chat, is we're going to be able to continue to use this material and for the design of the next webinar. Gary.
Simply to thank you, Penny, for starting this process, for starting this discussion. Very, I think, very useful and informative, and hopefully that the conversation will continue, and out of it we'll get some really good ideas. But I'll now defer back to John.
Thank you, John.
Okay, thank you, Penny. It's been a very positive afternoon. I think Gary Allen when he said that this has been a work in progress since 2006, so 16 years is too
You're breaking
long.
up a bit there, John. Can you just move a bit closer to your... That might be better. Yeah.
So he's been saying that it's been too long. Is that better?
Yes.
Yeah. 16 years has been too long. I think the attendance that we've had this afternoon is a testament to the commitment of the Lorne community and the Surf Coast Shires, particularly, to address this problem now. We've heard from Leon Walker talking about accommodating seasonal workers, the work that's being done there. Libby, thank you for your informative presentation on the Aireys Inlet project. There are certainly things we can take out of that. And Louise, thank you for a comprehensive and very understandable explanation of community land. Just coming back to the problem itself, it seems to me the problem that we have in front of us has many facets. We've heard about this afternoon. There are seasonal workers. There is social and affordable housing as defined. There's key work accommodation, and there are families to feed our schools. And I think they're all slightly different problems, and there'll be slightly different solutions. The problems that we're addressing are not unique to them. We have another unique aspect in that we are locked and zoning in bushfire, so that adds complexity to the task and solution. The Committee for Lorne is committed to following up the accommodation report, but there is not a solution to the problem, and the Committee for Lorne does not have the time or the resources. We don't have any budget, but what we have is the ability to harness the power of the community, and that's what we will be asking to do. We'll be asking you, the 60 people who have taken the time out this afternoon, to give us a bit more of your time to develop some of these solutions, because there are a number of solutions to this problem, and what we need is to develop some working groups to flesh out some of these solutions. Some of them will be roadblocks, and we won't be able to find a solution. But unless we tackle all the options and pursue them, we won't come to the answer that we need. Thank you.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you so much, John. That's exactly right. We've got different solutions for different problems, and we have to be matching those. We have to be learning about all of them, weighing them up, deciding which pathway we want. But we need the courage of the community on this to help make those choices. This has to be determined by the grassroots process that was started by Ian Stewart and the Committee for Lorne, and is now being continued in the conversation by a range of different people. As I said, for the next one, we've been lining up the guy from Queensland to tell us, Andrew Paul, his name is, to tell us the experience of setting up a CLT for him in a resort community where he couldn't build, but he had key and essential workers. He had issues with seasonal workers. So we just want to hear that story and see how he solved that. And also we're gathering more intelligence from around other places to also share what they're doing and see what we can learn. But most of all, I want to thank the people who've been engaged with this. I've overcome the flutter of heckling at the beginning, and I think I took the fluster quite okay, but I did miss a few things. So I missed the chance to thank the audience. I missed the chance to thank all the speakers for their incredible generosity. And I want to say that of all the people that you're looking at, only some of them are paid to do this. Most of the people you are looking at that have been working on this have been volunteers, and it's on the strength of the contribution of the volunteers, plus the cooperation with the people whose job it is. We're very thankful for that. So thanks for joining us. There will be a follow-up one, and maybe a follow-up one after that. And then the deliberative process needs to happen, which is likely to be more of a face-to-face facilitated thing. But it's, John and Committee for Lorne will discuss the processes that we've got in place to try and bring about some of that deliberative exchange. But at the moment, while we're still learning from each other, I'm just so grateful that so many people showed up and obviously care about making Lorne a a place to live where everybody can live and they don't have to travel up and down the highway or up and down the mountain to be here. All those questions will be kept, and Anna and I are meeting tomorrow about setting up a project webpage where we can store the information and keep the questions going. So thanks very much, everyone. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Great job, Penny.
Anything.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Great.